great Joel Pollak is here. He's Breitbart Senior Editor-at-Large. Joel, how are you, sir?
Good morning from Hillsdale College in Michigan. How are you today?
What brings you to Hillsdale College, sir?
I delivered a lecture yesterday in honor of my late mother-in-law, Rhoda Kadali, who was a great anti-apartheid activist and who became a Trump supporter late in her life. And we've been able to endow a journalism scholarship here at Hillsdale College in her name.
Well, that's wonderful.
Yeah. So
why did you choose Hillsdale? Congratulations. That's like a really big deal, and that's wonderful. Why Hillsdale?
Well, as you know, I went to Harvard for undergraduate and for law school, and Harvard has really lost its way, I think irretrievably so. And Hillsdale continues to, not just of this country, but of a classical education. And so I think that Hillsdale will persevere and remain, I think, a defender of the values that support our society long after Harvard has sunk into its own internal turmoil. I mean, look at what's happening in the other Ivy Leagues as students have started to come back already to campus, and at Harvard as well. There have been protests. There have been incidents of anti-Semitism. It's just picking up where it left off in the spring. Meanwhile, Hillsdale has started. Everything's great. Beautiful sunrise this morning in a few minutes. It's a completely different picture.
Yeah. All of the Ivy's loss is to Hillsdale's benefit, and surely some other gems across the country as well, like Hillsdale. Well, let's talk about what happened in Israel. What do we know about this American as well among the six?
So let me try to summarize it for you. As you know, Hamas took over 250 hostages when it carried out its terror attack on October 7th, 2023, last year, murdered 1,200 people, most of whom were civilians, and took over 250 hostages. In a truce in November, in exchange for Israel releasing hundreds of female and teenage terrorism convicts, Hamas released several dozen women, elderly hostages, some sick hostages, and most of the children, although there are still some children missing, notably the two children of the Bibas family from a place called Kibbutz near Oz in Israel. They are still unaccounted for and presumed to be captive in Gaza. But Hamas released several dozen. In the interim, since November, many more hostages have died or have been killed, and Israel managed to rescue about half a dozen in different operations. Now there are about 100 hostages left, two-thirds of whom may still be alive. And the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli soldiers, are closing in on the locations where the hostages are believed to be held. What Hamas decided to do after Israel rescued 4 hostages in June was to issue a standing order to its terrorists that if they suspect Israeli soldiers are coming, they are to murder the hostages. That appears to have happened last week as Israeli soldiers closed in on the location of 6 hostages in a tunnel underneath the town of Rafah in southern Gaza. The Hamas terrorists murdered these 6 hostages, including one American-born Israeli hostages named Hirsch Goldberg Polin, who was born in California and grew up in Chicago, and his family eventually moved to Israel. He served in the Israeli military. He was taking a vacation. He was at the Nova Music Festival on October 7th and was abducted after losing his hand in the terror attack, his left hand, his dominant hand. So he survived nearly 11 months in captivity without his hand and was eventually shot like the other 5 hostages he was found dead with in the back of the head. He was executed in brutal fashion by Hamas in order to prevent him from being rescued. His rescue would have been a huge boost to national morale. It would have been a big event in the United States. His parents had just given a speech at the Democratic Convention in Chicago urging the release of the hostages. And so it's quite devastating, and there's a lot of anguish about it in Israel. There's anguish in the United States. I was in Chicago on on Labor Day, and members of his grandmother's Jewish congregation were watching the funeral on live stream together. So really a terrible loss. The protests that have erupted since these 6 hostages were found murdered are partly just an outpouring of anguish. People are just really upset that this happened. But keep in mind that Netanyahu has a very loud and vociferous opposition that was there last year before the October 7th war and has returned again to the streets of Israel. And they are blaming Netanyahu for the failure to reach a hostage deal, not because it's really his fault, but just because Israelis are so politically divided. There was a brief moment of unity after the October 7th terror attack, but the Israeli opposition has never liked Netanyahu, and they have been very good at getting people into the streets. They don't represent the majority of Israelis, but they do represent a significant and vocal minority that has been, sorry to say, encouraged by the Biden administration, both implicitly and explicitly. Biden has said that he would like to see Netanyahu removed from power democratically, echoing Chuck Schumer. He's often been very critical of Netanyahu. He was critical of Netanyahu when he came back to the White House earlier this week, saying that Netanyahu could do more to reach a hostage deal. However, as Netanyahu pointed out in a press conference earlier this week, the United States, the Biden administration, has admitted that Israel has actually agreed to every hostage deal proposal, and Hamas has refused. So it's not clear what Netanyahu could do to reach a hostage deal other than surrendering and giving up on the war, allowing Hamas to win, to survive, to return to power. And maybe there are some people who think he should do that. Certainly there are some hostage families in Israel who would like that, and you can understand their position. They are thinking about their relatives who are hostages. Not all the hostage families feel that way. Some of them don't want Israel to give up the fight, even if it means rescuing their relatives. But there are some people who want their husbands, sons, daughters back at any cost, and they are arguing that Israel can always go back to war to fight Hamas if necessary, but let's just end this war right now and get the hostages back. Hamas has never promised to release all of the hostages, so even if Israel ended the war, it would only get some of the hostages back. But that's where this is. And Netanyahu gave a press conference earlier this week in which he explained why he would not accept the deal that Hamas wanted. Hamas wants Israel not just to end the war, but specifically to withdraw from the border between Egypt and Gaza, an area called the Philadelphia Corridor. It's basically a road that runs along the border. And Israel has discovered dozens of smuggling tunnels under that border, as well as rocket launchers and things like that. But basically, the border is so porous that if Israel left, if the soldiers left, Hamas would use it to smuggle weapons back into Gaza and to rearm itself for the next terror attack, for the next war. So Netanyahu, using maps, explained to the Israeli media and the international media that this was non-negotiable. Israel was not going to give up on the Philadelphia Corridor, which it took, by the way, in May. The corridor is near the town of Rafah, which I mentioned earlier. That's the town underneath which the 6 dead hostages were found. Kamala Harris and Joe Biden told Israel not to go into Rafah back in February, and they delayed Israel's Rafah operation by 3 months through their objections. Israel went into Rafah. It killed hundreds, maybe thousands of terrorists there, and it began trying to rescue the hostages. And there's an argument that if Israel had been able to go into Rafah earlier, then perhaps it could have rescued the hostages, and we wouldn't be in this position. The world would not be in this position. So there are serious questions about Kamala Harris's judgment. There are serious questions about the pressure that they're putting on Netanyahu. Netanyahu has responded to the pressure by saying, you need to be pressuring Hamas. It's absurd that in the wake of the murder of 6 hostages, including an American, you'd be pressuring Israel to make a deal after Israel has agreed to every proposal the United States has made. And you should be pressuring Hamas. You should be pressuring Iran, which funds Hamas. But instead, the Biden administration and the Kamala Harris campaign really have been pressuring Netanyahu. So that's where we are. These protests in Israel, they are, again, an expression of national anguish. They're also being exploited by the Israeli opposition, which is trying to get rid of Netanyahu. Something interesting happened this week, and I'll close my thoughts with this. After Netanyahu gave his press conference, the leading opposition figures in Israel went on TV to offer a rebuttal, and they didn't actually dispute what he was saying about the importance of holding that border. They just argued that Israel could go back in after a hostage deal. That is, if they agreed to withdraw from the border and they got some hostages back, that they could then reinvade and take that border. And Netanyahu's argument is, no, we could not do that because the international pressure to keep us away from the border would be so great that we would be burning a lot of bridges if we decided to go back in there. The world would treat it like a reinvasion of Gaza. It would not simply allow us to take up our own positions, our old positions.